morning, folks. Welcome back to 3 Zen. Bobo's here. Happy New Year. I'm going to tell a story this morning, one that I promised earlier, about one of our instructor pilots when I went through pilot training. But first, as an introduction, I want to read a comment that I received on the video that I produced entitled Dead Bug. This lady says, "Love this. I lost my fighter pilot dad a year ago last Thanksgiving. I've spent time since then reading his military records and talking with the guys he served with. I'm learning about his life through their eyes and the eyes of my adult self. I'm even more impressed with this extraordinary group of people. I grew up on base among them and their families. I'm truly grateful that they are the most valuable heritage my dad gave me." That just really warms my soul. That's one of the objectives of this channel, is to perhaps give you some insight into the men and women that taught us, and the men and women we looked up to, the men and women I felt obligated to honor by honoring the values that they instilled in us. This is the story of one of those men, Marshal Tilley. Now, I never flew with Captain Tilley. He scared the hell out of me. But today I think of him as in pure admiration. And he reminds me a lot of the fighter pilot father this woman's talking about. So I'm going to read the story. I found it in a newspaper article once. I just happened to stumble across it. I don't know where, I don't know when, I don't know how. But it comes from a newspaper out of Georgia, and it's entitled "A Veteran's Story. I'd Do It All Over Again." In June 1968, a new marshal arrived in town. The town was Karat, Thailand. The new marshal was First Lieutenant Marshal Tilley, an F-105 fighter jock. Nicknamed the Thud, Lead Sled, or Hyper Hog, an F-105 carried a bigger bomb load than the legendary B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers of World War II. The bad guys stalked the Badlands were Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese communist soldiers. Marshal Tilley fought the good fight for a year, completing 152 combat missions. Tilley, a Newton County resident, retired to social circle last year after a long and distinguished career in aviation. This is his story. "I lived in northwestern Louisiana, which means I'm more of an East Texan than a Cajun," said Tilley, a native of Louisiana and graduate of Louisiana Tech. "To defer the cost of college, I joined Louisiana Tech's Air Force ROTC program. After graduation in 1966, the Air Force sent Tilley for undergraduate pilot training in Laredo, Texas. We trained on the T-41, the military version of the Cessna 172. Then came the jet trainers like the T-37 Tweety Bird and the supersonic T-38 Talon. My last navigational training flight was to my new assignment, F-105 training at McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, Kansas. The F-105 was huge, and the only thing I could think of was, what have I gotten myself into?" And I've heard that so many times from these guys. What have I gotten myself into? As aircraft losses in Vietnam escalated, pilot training classes grew with the need for replacements. Normally 1 or 2 trained at once, but we had 29 pilots in our class. The 105 was a great plane, sturdy and dependable. It was originally built to deliver a nuclear weapon at low level, but became the workhorse in the bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese. Thuds are credited with 75% of the bombing missions. In May 1968, Tilley removed his second lieutenant butter bars to pin on silver bars of a first lieutenant. Next stop, the air war in Vietnam. "I still recall the commercial flight out of Travis Air Force Base in California," he said. "We saw the Golden Gate Bridge fade with the setting sun, and I'm sure all of us wondered if we would ever see it again." Truth. On attending jungle survival school in the Philippines, we called that snake school, Tilly stated, an instructor told us the quickest anybody applied what we were taught in survival school was 24 hours. A pilot actually left survival training in the Philippines only to be shot down over North Vietnam 24 hours later. At least his training helped him survive the ordeal. June 1968. First Lieutenant Marshal Tilley arrives at Korat, Thailand, one of the two F-105 bases in the land of 1,000 smiles. Several of us were assigned to the 429th Fighter Squadron, said Tilley. We lost 3 of them during our tour. We all received a short orientation flight the first day. On the second day, we went to war. Tilley's first target in the war was a North Vietnamese bridge and road network. His second mission was diverted. We were refueling on a tanker when we got the call that 3 of our airplanes had gone down. They diverted us to one of the rescue missions. That was my first of several rescue missions, but at least this one was successful. We got the pilot out safely. While discussing the rescue mission, Tilley fast-forwarded to Christmas Day, 1968. I flew 2 rescue missions during the Mugia Pass. One of the missions, the rescue chopper spotted the pilot in his parachute in a jungle canopy. They lowered the PJ, the parajumper, on a hoist in an attempt to rescue him. We heard the PJ yell, "The pilot is inert, get me out of here." Then gunfire erupted. The PJ kept yelling, "Get me out of here, get me out of here," but we had flown into an ambush. The enemy shot the PJ off the hoist. We ran into the same ambush scenario the next day, but we were forced to leave the deceased pilot hanging. We didn't fall into that trap. 2 months later into his tour, Marshal Tilley was chosen to carry a heavier load than bombs. The flight commander came in and said, "You're going to lead flights." And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm going to be a flight leader? A first lieutenant with 2 months' experience in combat leading flights into war? Well, with the rotations and losses, I didn't have much of a choice. Funny thing is, I soon led flights with colonels on my wing. Rank didn't matter, experience did. If you're new in country, you have to learn. With the flights of 2 ships or 20, it didn't matter. There was always something going on, decision making, lots of decisions. You follow the leader, and if he slams into a mountain, so do you. That happened more than people know. I'm going to take pause here. These guys, I have heard this. If I hit a mountain, I expect to look over my right or left shoulder and see another fireball in the same formation. You just better be there. They drilled that philosophy into us almost from the first day we got into jets. It was just the spirit of the individuals we flew with. When President Johnson called a bombing halt in 1968, Tilley already had 68 missions logged over in North Vietnam. He would log another 84 in the secretive war over Laos. On one mission, an enemy SAM, surface-to-air missile, came within a few feet of his tail assembly. He flew with a legend that day, the legendary West Point football player Doc Blanchard, and the first college player to ever win the Heisman, college junior to win the Heisman Trophy. Having 152 harrowing combat missions, then Captain Marshal Tilley returned home, finished his 6 years in the Air Force, flew Eastern Airlines commercial jets until their bankruptcy, then flew 26 years with Air Tran. Tilley logged over 20,000 hours during his career as a pilot. Final thoughts. The lead sled was a great plane. We flew challenging missions, and I'd love to strap one on one more time. I recall watching all the rebuilding going on in North Vietnam during the bombing halts. We flew cover for recon missions, but couldn't fire unless we were fired upon. So we thought we received fire many times, if you get my drift. Watching the reconstruction of a sworn enemy is tough. Like we weren't taking the war seriously, much like today. This article was written in 2016, and it can be said today also. We weren't serious then, we're not serious now, but I'd do it all over again. Marshal Tilley received 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 13 Air Medals in Southeast Asia. 1 Distinguished Flying Cross and 1 Air Medal were for assisting in the rescue of downed pilots. Of the 833 F-105 Thunder Chiefs produced, 382 were lost in Southeast Asia. These guys, including this lady's father, were our heroes. We looked up to them. When I went through pilot training, our flight comprised of guys who returned from Southeast Asia and what were called in those days plowbacks. Today, plowbacks are referred to as FAPEs. I think some FAPE didn't like the word plowback because it was demeaning, and the rest of the story is history. But I loved our plowbacks. My instructor was a plowback, Rick Vale, and those guys were just salt of the earth. But one of the reasons I share these stories, and I think they need to be shared, is because these guys, like I said earlier, were our heroes. They were demanding, but they didn't set standards that they themselves didn't achieve. They didn't ask of us more than they would ask of themselves, but they held us to those standards. And I found myself doing the same when I became an instructor pilot, because I felt doing anything less would have dishonored those men, and I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to compromise their values. So as I read Captain Tilley's story, and I think of him sitting in the corner, and I think of myself looking over thinking, I hope he doesn't look at me. I hope he doesn't look at me. I would love to shake his hand today, because I'm just so grateful we had men like him, and Captain Ford Barrett, Bill Seckerly, Dan Bowes. I think Dan Bowes might have been a plowback. Spencer was. Roger Spencer was a plowback. And Captain Roger Gossick. Roger was an RF-4 guy. And I love that guy. I actually befriended him when I came back to Randolph years later. But he once said in pilot training, when he was giving us our morning standardization briefing, he was talking about one of the emergency procedures, one of the EPs. And he said, all right, in this situation, you're going to have busy hands trying to keep everything together. But just remember, busy hands are happy hands. And I never forgot that. And years later, when I caught up with Roger in Florida, we laughed about that. Busy hands are happy hands. And I so admire those guys. And I hope my stories do them the honor they deserve. So, with deep respect this morning, gentlemen,